The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 24. Next day, towards night, we laid up under a little willow towhead out in the middle, where there was a village on each side of the river, and the Duke and the King begun to lay out a plan for working them towns. Jim, he spoke to the Duke and said he hoped it wouldn't take but a few hours, because it got mighty heavy and tiresome to him when he had to lay all day in the wigwam tied with the rope. You see, when we left him all alone, we had to tie him, because if anybody happened onto him all by himself and not tied, it wouldn't look much like he was a runaway nigger, you know. So the Duke said it was kind of hard to have to lay roped all day, and he'd cipher out some way to get around it. He was uncommon bright, the Duke was, and he soon struck it. He dressed Jim up in King Lear's outfit. It was a long curtain calico gown and a white horsehair wig and whiskers, and then he took his theater paint and painted Jim's face and hands and ears and neck all over a dead, dull, solid blue, like a man that's been drownded 9 days. Blamed if he weren't the horriblest looking outrage I ever see. Then the Duke took and wrote out a sign on a shingle so, "Sick Arab, but harmless when not out of his head." And he nailed that shingle to a lath, and stood the lath up 4 or 5 foot in front of the wigwam. Jim was satisfied. He said it was a sight better than lying tied a couple of years every day, and trembling all over every time there was a sound. The Duke told him to make himself free and easy, and if anybody ever come meddling around, he must hop out of the wigwam and carry on a little, and fetch a howl or two like a wild beast, and he reckoned they would light out and leave him alone. Which was sound enough judgment, but you take the average man, and he wouldn't wait for him to howl. Why, he didn't only look like he was dead, he looked considerable more than that. These rapscallions wanted to try the Nonesuch again, because there was so much money in it, but they judged it wouldn't be safe, because maybe the news might have worked along down by this time. They couldn't hit no project that suited exactly, so at last the Duke said he reckoned he'd lay off and work his brains an hour or two and see if he couldn't put up something on the Arkansas village, and the King, he allowed he would drop over to the other village without any plan, but just trust in Providence to lead him the profitable way, meaning the devil, I reckon. We had all bought store clothes where we stopped last, and now the King put his'n on, and he told me to put mine on. I done it, of course. The King's duds was all black, and he did look real swell and starchy. I never knowed how clothes could change a body before. Why, before, he looked like the orneriest old rip that ever was. But now, when he'd take off his new white beaver and make a bow and do a smile, he looked that grand and good and pious that you'd say he had walked right out of the ark and maybe was old Leviticus himself. Jim cleaned up the canoe, and I got my paddle ready. There was a big steamboat laying at the shore away up under the point, about 3 mile above the town. Been there a couple of hours, taking on freight. Says the King, "Seeing how I'm dressed, I reckon maybe I better arrive down from St. Louis or Cincinnati or some other big place. Go for the steamboat, Huckleberry. We'll come down to the village on her." I didn't have to be ordered twice to go and take a steamboat ride. I fetched the shore a half a mile above the village, and then went scooting along the bluff bank in the easy water. Pretty soon we come to a nice, innocent-looking young country Jake setting on a log swabbing the sweat off of his face, for it was powerful warm weather, and he had a couple of big carpet-bags by him. "Run her nose in shore," says the King. I done it. "Where you bound for, young man?" "For the steamboat going to New Orleans." "Get aboard," said the King. "Hold on a minute. My servant'll help you with them bags. Jump out and help the gentleman, Adolphus," meaning me, I see. I done so, and then we all three started on again. The young chap was mighty thankful, said it was tough work toting his baggage such weather. He asked the king where he was going, and the king told him he'd come down the river and landed at the other village this morning, and now he was going up a few mile to see an old friend on a farm up there. The young fellow says, "When I first see you, I says to myself, it's Mr. Wilkes, sure, and he come mighty near getting here in time. But then I says again, no, I reckon it ain't him, or else he wouldn't be paddling up the river. You ain't him, are you?" "No, my name's Blodgett, Alexander Blodgett. Reverend Alexander Blodgett, I suppose I must say, as I'm one of the Lord's poor servants. But still, I'm just as able to be sorry for Mr. Wilkes for not arriving in time all the same, if he's missed anything by it, which I hope he hasn't." "Well, he don't miss any property by it, because he'll get that all right, but he's missed seeing his brother Peter die, which he mayn't mind, nobody can tell as to that, but his brother would have give anything in this world to see him before he died. Never talked about nothing else all these 3 weeks, hadn't seen him since they was boys together, and hadn't ever seen his brother William at all. That's the deaf and dumb one. William ain't more than 30 or 35. Peter and George were the only ones that come out here. George was the married brother. Him and his wife both died last year. Harvey and William's the only ones that's left now, and as I was saying, they haven't got here in time." "Did anybody send 'em word?" "Oh, yes, a month or 2 ago, when Peter was first took, because Peter said then that he sort of felt like he weren't going to get well this time. You see, he was pretty old, and George's girls was too young to be much company for him, except Mary Jane, the red-headed one, and so he was kinder lonesome after George and his wife died, and didn't seem to care much to live. He most desperately wanted to see Harvey, and William too, for that matter, because he was one of them kind that can't bear to make a will. He left a letter behind for Harvey, and said he'd told in it where his money was hid, and how he wanted the rest of the property divided up so George's girls would be all right, for George didn't leave nothing, and that letter was all they could get him to put a pen to." "Why do you reckon Harvey don't come? Where does he live?" "Oh, he lives in England, Sheffield, preaches there, hasn't ever been in this country. He hasn't had any too much time, and besides, he mightn't a got the letter at all, you know." Too bad, too bad. He couldn't have lived to see his brothers, poor soul. You going to Orleans, you say?" "Yes, but that ain't only a part of it. I'm going in a ship next Wednesday for Rio Janeiro, where my uncle lives." "It's a pretty long journey, but it'll be lovely. Wished I was a-going." "Is Mary Jane the oldest? How old is the others?" "Mary Jane's 19, Susan's 15, and Joanna's about 14. That's the one that gives herself to good works and has a hare-lip." "Poor things, to be left alone in the cold world so." "Well, they could be worse off. Old Peter had friends, and they ain't going to let them come to no harm. There's Hobson, the Baptist preacher, and Deacon Lot Hovey, and Ben Rucker, and Abner Shackelford, and Levi Bell the lawyer, and Dr. Robinson and their wives, and the widow Bartley, and, well, there's a lot of them, but these are the ones that Peter was thickest with, and used to write about sometimes when he wrote home, so Harvey'll know where to look for friends when he gets here." Well, the old man went on asking questions till he just fairly emptied that young fella. Blamed if he didn't inquire about everybody and everything in that blessed town, and all about the Wilkeses, and about Peter's business, which was a tanner, and about George's, which was a carpenter, and about Harvey's, which was a dissentering minister, and so on and so on. Then he says, "What did you want to walk all the way up to the steamboat for?" Because she's a big Orleans boat, and I was afeard she mightn't stop there. When they're deep, they won't stop for a hail. A Cincinnati boat will, but this is a St. Louis one." "Was Peter Wilkes well off?" "Oh, yes, pretty well off. He had houses and land, and it's reckoned he left 3 or 4 thousand in cash hid up summers." "When did you say he died?" "I didn't say, but it was last night." "Funeral tomorrow, likely?" "Yes, 'bout the middle of the day." "Well, it's all terrible sad, but we've all got to go one time or another. So what we want to do is to be prepared. Then we're all right." "Yes, sir, it's the best way. Ma used to always say that." When we struck the boat, she was about done loading, and pretty soon she got off. The king never said nothing about going aboard, so I lost my ride after all. When the boat was gone, the king made me paddle up another mile to a lonesome place, and then he got ashore and says, "Now hustle back right off and fetch the Duke up here, and the new carpet-bags. And if he's gone over to the other side, go over there and get him, and tell him to get himself up regardless. Shove along now." I see what he was up to, but I never said nothing, of course. When I got back with the Duke, we hid the canoe, and then they set down on a log, and the king told him everything, just like the young fellow had said it, every last word of it. And all the time he was a-doing it, he tried to talk like an Englishman, and he'd done it pretty well, too, for a slouch. I can't imitate him, and so I ain't a-going to try to, but he really done it pretty good. Then he says, "How are you on the deaf and dumb, Bilgewater?" The Duke said leave him alone for that, said he had played a deaf and dumb person on the histrionic boards. So then they waited for a steamboat. About the middle of the afternoon, a couple of little boats come along, but they didn't come from high enough up the river. But at last there was a big one, and they hailed her. She sent out her yawl, and we went aboard, and she was from Cincinnati. And when they found we only wanted to go 4 or 5 mile, they was booming mad, and gave us a cussing, and said they wouldn't land us. But the king was calm. He says, "If gentlemen can afford to pay $1 a mile apiece to be took on and put off in a yawl, a steamboat can afford to carry 'em, can't it?" So they softened down and said it was all right, and when we got to the village they yawled us ashore. About 24 men flocked down when they see the yawl a-coming, and when the king says, "Can any of you gentlemen tell me where Mr. Peter Wilkes lives?" They give a glance at one another and nodded their heads, as much as to say, "What did I tell you?" Then one of them says, kind of soft and gentle, "I'm sorry, sir, but the best we can do is to tell you where he did live yesterday evening." Sudden as winking, the ornery old creature went and to smash, and fell up against the man, and put his chin on his shoulder, and cried down his back, and says, "Alas, alas, our poor brother gone, and we never got to see him. Oh, it's too hard." Then he turns around, blubbering, and makes a lot of idiotic signs to the Duke on his hands, and blamed if he didn't drop a carpet-bag and bust out a-crying. If they weren't the beatenest lot, them 2 frauds, that ever I struck. Well, the men gathered around and sympathized with them, and said all sorts of kind things to them, and carried their carpet-bags up the hill for them, and let them lean on them and cry, and told the king all about his brother's last moments, and the king, he told it all over again on his hands to the Duke, and both of them took on about that dead tanner like they'd lost the 12 disciples. Well, if ever I struck anything like it, I'm a nigger. It was enough to make a body ashamed of the human race. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 25. The news was all over town in 2 minutes, and you could see the people tearing down on the run from every which way, some of them putting on their coats as they come. Pretty soon we was in the middle of a crowd, and the noise of the tramping was like a soldier march. The windows in dooryards was full, and every minute somebody would say over a fence, "Is it them?" And somebody trotting along with the gang would answer back and say, "You bet it is." When we got to the house, the street in front of it was packed, and the 3 girls was standing in the door. Marsy Jane was red-headed, but that don't make no difference. She was most awful beautiful, and her face and her eyes was all lit up like glory. She was so glad her uncles was come. The king, he spread his arms, and Marsy Jane, she jumped for them, and the hare-lip jumped for the duke, and there they had it. Everybody most, leastways women, cried for joy to see them meet again at last, and have such good times. Then the king, he hunched the duke private. I see him do it. And then he looked around and see the coffin over in the corner on 2 chairs. So then him and the duke, with a hand across each other's shoulder and the other hand to their eyes, walked slow and solemn over there, everybody dropping back to give them room, and all the talk and noise stopping, people saying "shh," and all the men taking their hats off and drooping their heads, so you could heard a pin fall. And when they got there, they bent over and looked in the coffin, and took one sight, and then they bust out a-crying so you could a heard them to Orleans most, and then they put their arms around each other's necks, and hung their chins over each other's shoulders, and then for 3 minutes, or maybe 4, I never see 2 men leak the way they done, and mind you, everybody was doing the same, and the place was that damp I never seen anything like it. Then one of them got on one side of the coffin, and the other on the other side, and they kneeled down and rested their foreheads on the coffin, and let on to pray all to themselves. Well, when it come to that, it worked the crowd like you never seen anything like it, and everybody broke down and went to sobbing right out loud, the poor girls too, and every woman nearly went up to the girls without saying a word, and kissed them solemn on the forehead, and then put their hand on their head, and looked up towards the sky with the tears running down, and then busted out and went off sobbing and swabbing, and give the next woman a show. I never see anything so disgusting. Well, by and by, the king, he gets up and comes forward a little, and works himself up and slobbers out a speech all full of tears and flapdoodle about its being a sore trial for him and his poor brother to lose the deceased, and to miss seeing deceased alive after the long journey of 4,000 a mile, but it's a trial that's sweetened and sanctified to us by this dear sympathy and these holy tears, and so he thanks them out of his heart and out of his brother's heart, because out of their mouths they can't, words being too weak and cold, and all that kind of rotten slush, till it was just sickening. And then he blubbers out a pious goody-goody amen, and turns himself loose and goes to crying fit to bust. And the minute the words were out of his mouth, somebody over in the crowd struck up the doxology, and everybody joined in with all their might, and it just warmed you up and made you feel as good as church letting out. Music is a good thing, and after all that sour butter and hogwash, I never see it freshen up things so, and sound so honest and bully. Then the king begins to work his jaw again, and says how him and his nieces would be glad if a few of the main principal friends of the family would take supper here with them this evening, and help set up with the ashes of the deceased, and says if his poor brother laying yonder could speak, he knows who he would name, for they was names that was very dear to him, and mentioned often in his letters, and so he will name the same, to wit, as follows: Videlicet, Reverend Mr. Hobson, and Deacon Lot Hovey, and Mr. Ben Rucker, and Abner Shackelford, and Levi Bell, and Dr. Robinson, and their wives, and the widow Bartley. Reverend Hobson and Dr. Robinson was down to the end of the town a-hunting together. That is, the doctor was shipping a sick man to the other world, and the preacher was pinting him right. Lawyer Bell was away up to Louisville on business, but the rest was on hand, and so they all come and shook hands with the king and thanked him and talked to him, and then they shook hands with the Duke and didn't say nothing, but just kept a-smiling and bobbing their heads like a passel of sapheads, whilst he made all sorts of signs with his hands and said goo-goo, goo-goo-goo all the time, like a baby that can't talk. So the king he blattered along and managed to inquire about pretty much everybody and dog in town by his name, and mentioned all sorts of little things that happened one time or another in the town, or to George's family, or to Peter. And he always let on that Peter wrote him the things, but that was a lie. He got every blessed one of them out of that young flathead that we canoed up to the steamboat. Then Mary Jane she fetched the letter her father left behind, and the king he read it out loud and cried over it. It gave the dwelling house and $3,000 gold to the girls, and it gave the tanyard, which was doing a good business, along with some other houses and land worth about $7,000, and $3,000 in gold to Harvey and William, and told where the $6,000 cash was hid down cellar. So these two frauds said they'd go and fetch it up, and have everything square and above board, and told me to come with a candle. We shut the cellar door behind us, and when they found the bag they split it out on the floor, and it was a lovely sight, all them yaller boys. My, the way the king's eyes did shine. He slaps the Duke on the shoulder and says, "Oh, this ain't bully nor nothing. Oh, no, I reckon not. Why, Bilgy, it beats the nonesuch, don't it?" The Duke allowed it did. They pawed the yaller boys, and sifted them through their fingers, and let them jingle down on the floor, and the king says, "It ain't no use talking. Being brothers to a rich dead man, and representatives of furrin heirs that's got left is the line for you and me, Bilge. This year comes of trusting to Providence. It's the best way in the long run. I've tried 'em all, and there ain't no better way." Most everybody would have been satisfied with the pile, and took it on trust, but no, they must count it. So they counts it, and it comes out $415 short. Says the king, "Darn him! I wonder what he'd done with that $415. They worried over that a while, and ransacked all around for it. Then the Duke says, "Well, he was a pretty sick man, and likely he made a mistake. I reckon that's the way of it. The best way's to let it go, and keep still about it. We can spare it." "Oh, shucks, yes, we can spare it. I don't care nothing about that. It's the count I'm thinking about. We want to be awful square and open and above board here, you know. We want to lug this here money upstairs and count it before everybody. Then there ain't nothing suspicious. But when the dead man says there's $6,000, you know, we don't want to—" "Hold on," says the Duke. "Let's make up the deficit." And he begun to haul out yaller boys out of his pocket. "It's a most amazing good idea, Duke. You have got a rattling clever head on you," says the king. "Blessed if the old nonesuch ain't a-hepping us out again." And he begun to haul out yaller jackets and stack them up. It most busted them, but they made up the 6,000 clean and clear. "Say," says the Duke, "I got another idea. Let's go upstairs and count this money, and then take and give it to the girls." "Good land, Duke, let me hug you. It's the most dazzling idea 'at ever a man struck. You have certainly got the most astonishing head I ever see. Oh, this is the boss dodge. There ain't no mistake about it. Let 'em fetch along their suspicions now if they want to. This'll lay 'em out." When we got upstairs, everybody gathered around the table, and the king, he counted it and stacked it up, $300 in a pile, 20 elegant little piles. Everybody looked hungry at it and licked their chops. Then they raked it into the bag again, and I see the king begin to swell himself up for another speech. He says, "Friends, all my poor brother that lays yonder has done generous by them that's left behind in the vale of sorrows. He has done generous by these, your poor little lambs that he loved and sheltered, and that's left fatherless and motherless. Yes, and we know that knowed him knows that he would have done more generous by 'em if he hadn't been afeard of wounding his dear William and me. Now, wouldn't he? There ain't no question 'bout it in my mind. Well, then, what kind of brothers would it be that'd stand in his way at such a time? And what kind of uncles would it be that'd rob, yes, rob, such poor sweet lambs as these, that he loved so at such a time? If I know William, and I think I do, well, I'll just ask him." He turns around and begins to make a lot of signs to the Duke with his hands, and the Duke, he looks at him stupid and leather-headed a while. Then all of a sudden he seems to catch his meaning and jumps for the king, goo-gooing with all his might for joy, and hugs him about 15 times before he lets up. Then the king says, "I knowed it. I reckon that'll convince anybody the way he feels about it. Here, Mary Jane, Susan, Joanna, take the money. Take it all. It's the gift of him that lays yonder, cold but joyful." Mary Jane, she went for him. Susan and the hare-lip went for the Duke, and then such another hugging and kissing I never see yet. And everybody crowded up with tears in their eyes, and most shook the hands off them frauds, saying all the time, "You dear good souls, how lovely! How could you?" Well, then, pretty soon all hands got to talking about the deceased again, and how good he was, and what a loss he was, and all that, and before long a big iron-jawed man worked himself in there from outside, and stood a-listening and looking, and not saying anything, and nobody saying anything to him either, because the king was talking, and they was all busy listening. The king was saying, in the middle of something he'd started in on, "They being particular friends of the deceased, that's why they're invited here this evening. But tomorrow we want all to come, everybody, for he respected everybody, he liked everybody, and so it's fitting that his funeral orgies should be public." And so he went a-mooning on and on, liking to hear himself talk, and every little while he fetched in his funeral orgies again, till the Duke, he couldn't stand it no more, so he writes on a little scrap of paper, "Obsequies, you old fool," and folds it up, and goes to goo-gooing and reaching it over people's heads to him. The king, he reads it and puts it in his pocket and says, "Poor William, affected as he is, his heart's all is right. Asks me to invite everybody to come to the funeral, wants me to make 'em all welcome. But he needn't have worried. It was just what I was at." Then he weaves along again, perfectly calm, and goes to dropping in his funeral orgies again every now and then, just like he done before. And when he done it the third time, he says, "I say orgies, not because it's the common term, because it ain't, obsequies being the common term, but because orgies is the right term. Obsequies ain't used in England no more now, it's gone out. We say orgies now in England. Orgies is better because it means the thing you're after more exact. It's a word that's made up out in the Greek orgo, outside, open, abroad, and the Hebrew jism, to plant, cover up, hence inter. So, you see, funeral orgies is an open, public funeral." He was the worst I ever struck. Well, the iron-jawed man, he laughed right in his face. Everybody was shocked. Everybody says, "Why, doctor!" And Abner Shackelford says, "Why, Robinson, hain't you heard the news? This is Harvey Wilkes." The king, he smiled eager, and shoved out his flapper, and says, "Is it my poor brother's dear good friend and physician? Keep your hands off of me," says the doctor. "You talk like an Englishman, don't you? It's the worst imitation I ever heard. You Peter Wilkes's brother. You're a fraud. That's what you are." Well, how they all took on. They crowded around the doctor and tried to quiet him down, and tried to explain to him and tell him how Harvey did showed in 40 ways that he was Harvey, and knowed everybody by name, and the names of the very dogs, and begged him not to hurt Harvey's feelings and the poor girl's feelings and all that. But it warn't no use. He stormed right along and said any man that pretended to be an Englishman and couldn't imitate the lingo no better than what he did was a fraud and a liar. The poor girls was hanging to the king and crying, and all of a sudden the doctor ups and turns on them. He says, "I was your father's friend, and I'm your friend, and I warn you as a friend, and an honest one that wants to protect you and keep you out of harm and trouble, to turn your backs on that scoundrel and have nothing to do with him, the ignorant tramp, with his idiotic Greek and Hebrew, as he calls it. He is the thinnest kind of an impostor, has come here with a lot of empty names and facts which he picked up somewheres, and you take 'em for proofs, and are helped to fool yourself by these foolish friends here, who ought to know better. Mary Jane Wilkes, you know me for your friend, and for your unselfish friend, too. Now listen to me. Turn this pitiful rascal out. I beg you to do it. Will you?" Mary Jane straightened herself up, and but she was handsome. She says, "Here is my answer." She hove up the bag of money and put it in the king's hands and says, "Take this $6,000 and invest for me and my sisters any way you want to, and don't give us no receipt for it." Then she put her arm around the king on one side, and Susan and the hare-lip done the same on the other. Everybody clapped their hands and stomped on the floor like a perfect storm, whilst the king held up his head and smiled proud. The doctor says, "All right, I wash my hands of the matter, but I warn you all that a time's coming when you're going to feel sick whenever you think of this day." And away he went. "All right, doctor," says the king, kind of mocking him. "We'll try and get him to send for you," which made them all laugh, and they said it was a prime good hit. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 26. Well, when they was all gone, the king, he asked Mary Jane how they was off for spare rooms, and she said she had 1 spare room, which would do for Uncle William, and she'd give her own room to Uncle Harvey, which was a little bigger, and she would turn into the room with her sisters and sleep on a cot, and up garret was a little cubby with a pallet in it. The king said the cubby would do for his valley, meaning me. So Mary Jane took us up, and she showed them their rooms, which was plain but nice. She said she'd have her frocks and a lot of other traps took out of her room if they was in Uncle Harvey's way, but he said they weren't. The frocks was hung along the wall, and before them was a curtain made out of calico that hung down to the floor. There was an old hair trunk in one corner, and a guitar box in another, and all sorts of little knick-knacks and gimcracks around, like girls brisking up a room with. The king said it was all the more homely and more pleasanter for these fixin's, and so don't disturb them. The duke's room was pretty small, but plenty good enough, and so was my cubby. That night they had a big supper, and all them men and women was there, and I stood behind the king and the duke's chairs and waited on them, and the niggers waited on the rest. Mary Jane, she sat at the head of the table, with Susan alongside of her, and said how bad the biscuits was, and how mean the preserves was, and how ornery and tough the fried chickens was, and all that kind of rot, the way women always do for to force out compliments. And the people all knowed everything was tip-top, and said so, said, how do you get biscuits to brown so nice? And where, for the land's sake, did you get these amazing pickles? And all that kind of humbug talky-talk, just the way people always does at a supper, you know. And when it was all done, me and the hare-lip had supper in the kitchen off of the leavings, whilst the others was helping the niggers clean up the things. The hare-lip, she got to pumping me about England, and blessed if I didn't think the ice was getting mighty thin sometimes. She says, "Did you ever see the king?" "Who, William IV? Well, I bet I have. He goes to our church." I knowed he was dead years ago, but I never let on. So when I says he goes to our church, she says, "What, regular?" "Yes, regular. His pew's right over opposite ourn, on the other side of the pulpit." "I thought he lived in London." "Well, he does. Where would he live?" "But I thought you lived in Sheffield." I see I was up a stump. I had to let on to get choked with a chicken bone so as to get time to think how to get down again. Then I says, "I mean, he goes to our church regular when he's in Sheffield. That's only in the summertime, when he comes there to take the sea baths." "Why, how you talk! Sheffield ain't on the sea." "Well, who said it was?" "Why, you did." "I didn't nother." "You did." "I didn't." "You did." "I never said nothing of the kind." "Well, what did you say then?" "Said he come to take the sea baths. That's what I said." "Well, then, how's he going to take the sea baths if it ain't on the sea?" "Looky here," I says, "did you ever see any Congress water?" "Yes." "Well, did you have to go to Congress to get it?" "Why, no." "Well, neither does William IV have to go to the sea to get a sea bath." "How does he get it then?" "Gets it the way people down here gets Congress water, in barrels. There in the palace at Sheffield they've got furnaces, and he wants his water hot. They can't bile that amount of water away off there at the sea. They haven't got no conveniences for it." "Oh, I see now. You might have said that in the first place and saved time." When she said that, I see I was out of the woods again, and so I was comfortable and glad. Next she says, "Do you go to church too?" "Yes, regular." "Where do you sit?" "Why, in our pew." "Whose pew?" "Why, ourn, your Uncle Harvey's." "His'n? What does he want with a pew?" "Wants it to set in. What did you reckon he wanted with it?" "Why, I thought he'd be in the pulpit." "Rot him. I forgot he was a preacher." I see I was up a stump again, so I played another chicken bone and got another think. Then I says, "Blame it, do you suppose there ain't but one preacher to a church?" "Why, what do they want with more?" "What, to preach before a king? I never did see such a girl as you. They don't have no less than 17. 17? My land! Why, I wouldn't set out such a string as that, not if I never got to glory. It must take 'em a week." "Shucks, they don't all of 'em preach the same day, only one of 'em." "Well, then, what does the rest of 'em do?" "Oh, nothing much. Loll around, pass the plate, and one thing or another. But mainly, they don't do nothing." "Well, then, what are they for?" "Why, they're for style. Don't you know nothing?" "Well, I don't want to know no such foolishness as that. How is servants treated in England? Do they treat 'em better than we treat our niggers?" "No, a servant ain't nobody there. They treat them worse than dogs." "Don't they give 'em holidays the way we do, Christmas and New Year's week and 4th of July?" Oh, just listen. A body could tell you hain't ever been to England by that. Why, why, Joanna, they never see a holiday from year's end to year's end. Never go to the circus, nor theater, nor nigger shows, nor nowheres. Nor church? Nor church. But you always went to church. Well, I was gone up again. I forgot I was the old man's servant. But next minute I whirled in on a kind of an explanation how a valley was different from a common servant, and had to go to church whether he wanted to or not, and set with the family on account of its being the law. But I didn't do it pretty good, and when I got done, I see she weren't satisfied. She says, "Honest Injun, now, hain't you been telling me a lot of lies?" "Honest Injun," says I. "None of it at all?" "None of it at all, not a lie in it," says I. "Lay your hand on this book and say it." I see it weren't nothing but a dictionary, so I laid my hand on it and said it. So then she looked a little better satisfied and says, "Well then, I'll believe some of it, but I hope to gracious if I'll believe the rest." "What is it you won't believe, Joe?" says Mary Jane, stepping in with Susan behind her. "It ain't right nor kind for you to talk so to him, and him a stranger, and so far from his people. How would you like to be treated so?" "That's always your way, Mame, always sailing in to help somebody before they're hurt. I hain't done nothing to him. He's told some stretchers, I reckon, and I said I wouldn't swallow it all, and that's every bit and grain I did say. I reckon he can stand a little thing like that, can't he?" "I don't care whether 'twas little or whether 'twas big. He's here in our house and a stranger, and it wasn't good of you to say it. If you was in his place, it would make you feel ashamed, and so you oughtn't to say a thing to another person that will make them feel ashamed." "Why, ma'am, he said—" "It don't make no difference what he said. That ain't the thing. The thing is for you to treat him kind, and not be saying things to make him remember he ain't in his own country and amongst his own folks." I says to myself, this is a girl that I'm letting that old reptile rob her of her money? Then Susan, she waltzed in, and if you'll believe me, she did give hare-lip hark from the tomb. Says I to myself, and this is another one that I'm letting him rob her of her money? Then Mary Jane, she took another inning, and went in sweet and lovely again, which was her way, but when she got done, there warn't hardly anything left of poor hare-lip, so she hollered. "All right, then," says the other girls, "you just ask his pardon." She done it, too, and she done it beautiful. She done it so beautiful it was good to hear, and I wished I could tell her 1,000 lies so she could do it again. I says to myself, this is another one that I'm letting him rob her of her money, and when she got through, they all just laid themselves out to make me feel at home and know I was amongst friends. I felt so ornery and low down and mean that I says to myself, my mind's made up. I'll hide that money for them or bust. So then I lit out for bed. I said, meaning some time or another. When I got by myself, I went to thinking the thing over. I says to myself, shall I go to that doctor, private, and blow on these frauds? No, that won't do. He might tell who told him. Then the king and the duke would make it warm for me. Shall I go private and tell Mary Jane? No, that doesn't do it. Her face would give them a hint, sure. They've got the money, and they'd slide right out and get away with it. If she was to fetch in help, I'd get mixed up in the business before it was done with, I judge. No, there ain't no good way but one. I got to steal that money somehow, and I got to steal it some way that they won't suspicion that I done it. They've got a good thing here, and they ain't a-going to leave till they've played this family and this town for all they're worth, so I'll find a chance time enough. I'll steal it and hide it, and by, when I'm away down the river, I'll write a letter and tell Mary Jane where it's hid. But I better hive it tonight if I can, because the doctor maybe hasn't let up as much as he lets on he has. He might scare them out of here yet. So thinks I'll go and search them rooms. Upstairs the hall was dark, but I found the Duke's room and started to paw round it with my hands. But I recollected it wouldn't be much like the king to let anybody else take care of that money but his own self. So then I went to his room and begun to paw around there. But I see I couldn't do nothing without a candle, but I doesn't light one, of course. So I judged I'd got to do the other thing, lay for them and eavesdrop. About that time I hears their footsteps coming, and was going to skip under the bed. I reached for it, but it wasn't where I thought it would be. But I touched the curtain that hid Mary Jane's frocks, so I jumped in behind that and snuggled in amongst the gowns and stood there perfectly still. They come in and shut the door, and the first thing the Duke done was to get down and look under the bed. Then I was glad I hadn't found the bed when I wanted it. And yet, it's kind of natural to hide under the bed when you are up to anything private. They sits down then, and the king says, "Well, what is it?" And cut it middlin' short, because it's better for us to be down there a whooping up the morning than up here giving 'em a chance to talk us over. Well, this is it, Capet. I ain't easy. I ain't comfortable. That doctor lays on my mind. I wanted to know your plans. I've got a notion, and I think it's a sound one. What is it, Duke? That we better glide out of this before 3 in the morning and clip it down the river with what we've got. Specially seeing we got it so easy, given back to us, flung at our heads, as you may say, when of course we allowed to have to steal it back. I'm for knocking off and lighting out. That made me feel pretty bad. About an hour or two ago it would have been a little different, but now it made me feel bad and disappointed. The king rips out and says, "What? And not sell out the rest of the property? March off like a passel of fools and leave $8,000 or $9,000 worth of property laying around just suffering to be scooped in? And all good, saleable stuff, too?" The Duke, he grumbled, said the bag of gold was enough, and he didn't want to go no deeper, didn't want to rob a lot of orphans of everything they had. "Why, how you talk," says the king. "We shan't rob 'em of nothing at all but just this money. The people that buys the property is the sufferers, because as soon as it's found out that we didn't own it, which won't be long after we've slid, the sale won't be valid, and it'll all go back to the estate. These here orphans 'll get their house back again, and that's enough for them. They're young and spry and can easy earn a living. They ain't a-going to suffer. Why, just think, there's thousands and thousands that ain't nigh so well off. Bless you, they ain't got nothing to complain of." Well, the king, he talked him blind, so at last he give in and said all right, but said he believed it was blamed foolishness to stay, and that doctor hanging over them. But the king says, "Cuss the doctor. What do we care for him? Hain't we got all the fools in town on our side? And ain't that a big enough majority in any town?" So they got ready to go downstairs again. The Duke says, "I don't think we put that money in a good place." That cheered me up. I'd begun to think I warn't going to get a hint of no kind to help me. The king says, "Why?" "Because Mary Jane'll be in mourning from this out, and first the nigger that does up the rooms will get an order to box these duds up and put 'em away, and do you reckon a nigger can run across money and not borrow some of it?" "Your head's level again, Duke," says the king, and he comes a-fumbling under the curtain 2 or 3 foot from where I was. I stuck tight to the wall and kept mighty still, though quivery, and I wondered what them fellows would say to me if they ketched me, and I tried to think what I'd better do if they did catch me. But the king, he got the bag before I could think more than about a half a thought, and he never suspicioned I was around. They took and shoved the bag through a rip in the straw tick that was under the feather bed, and crammed it in a foot or two amongst the straw, and said it was all right now, because a nigger only makes up the feather bed, and don't turn over the straw tick only about twice a year, and so it warn't in no danger of getting stole now. But I knowed better. I had it out of there before they was halfway downstairs. I groped along up to my cubby and hid it there till I could get a chance to do better. I judged I better hide it outside of the house somewheres, because if they missed it, they would give the house a good ransacking. I knowed that very well. Then I turned in, with my clothes all on, but I couldn't have gone to sleep if I'd 'a' wanted to. I was in such a sweat to get through with the business. By and by I heard the king and the duke come up, so I rolled off my pallet and laid with my chin at the top of my ladder and waited to see if anything was going to happen, but nothing did. So I held on till all the late sounds had quit and the early ones hadn't begun yet, and then I slipped down the ladder. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.